Greetings, my dear viewer. This is a channel about marital infidelity and about the consequences if one spouse starts to cheat on the other. If you, as well as I do, support true family values and condemn cheating, then subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. Let's get started. I didn't know what I was hoping for. Maybe an apology, a reason, or even a clumsy effort to make things right. But when her eyes met mine and she simply said, "You'll get over it eventually," it hit me like a cold slap. She had no intention of offering any of those things. I got home earlier than usual that day, not because I had a clear suspicion, not consciously anyway. It was more of an uneasy instinct, an inexplicable pull urging me to be there. The second I walked through the door, I felt it. Something was off. The living room was awash in the kind of dim, cozy lighting she liked when winding down. But she wasn't there. No book in her hands, no TV murmuring in the background. Just silence, thick and unsettling. That's when I saw her phone, abandoned on the kitchen counter. She never left it unattended. It was practically an extension of her hand. But there it sat, its screen still lit from a recent message. That was the first crack in the fragile wall of denial I'd unknowingly built around myself. I didn't need to search. The message was right there, clear and unforgiving on the lock screen. "Can't stop thinking about last night." My brain resisted the words, refusing to stitch them into something real. This couldn't be happening, not with her, not to us. My hands moved before my mind could catch up, fingers unlocking the phone with mechanical precision, my heart pounding like a war drum. The conversation was open. I didn't need to guess who it was. The name didn't matter. The words said it all. No grand declarations of love, no guilt-soaked confessions. Just casual, familiar chatter threaded with an intimacy that screamed history. This wasn't a one-time mistake. This was a routine, a hidden part of her life that had been growing in the shadows. Then I heard footsteps in the hallway. I turned, phone still clutched in my hand, and there she was. No panic in her eyes, no scramble to cover her tracks, just a flicker of acknowledgement before she sighed, like she'd been waiting for this moment, almost relieved the secret was out. And then she said it, words that carved themselves into my memory. "You'll get over it eventually." It wasn't a plea, it wasn't even a question, just a flat, indifferent statement, tossed out like an afterthought. As if forgiveness was a given, as if she knew me better than I knew myself. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because my body didn't know how else to react. She stood there, arms folded, waiting for me to explode, to crumble, to drown in heartbreak. But I didn't. I just stared at her, and for the first time, I truly saw her. Not the woman I married. Not the person I thought I knew. Just a stranger with her mask finally off. Maybe that woman never existed. Maybe I had fallen for an illusion, a version of her I created in my mind. The silence between us grew heavier. I considered asking why, but what would be the point? The answer was already there, spelled out in the messages. It wasn't about passion or temptation. It was about indifference, the slow decay of something I hadn't realized was dying. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm. "No, I won't." For the first time, her expression shifted. A flicker of surprise, like she hadn't considered that response. I set her phone back on the counter and walked past her, heading to the bedroom. I needed space, even if it was just the next room. She didn't follow. She didn't say anything else. And for the first time since we met, I didn't want her to. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, my mind racing through every memory, every moment that led to this. Every conversation, every flimsy excuse, every late night at work, every solo trip she claimed was for her peace of mind. It was like flipping a switch. Suddenly everything made sense. I wasn't a fool for trusting her. I don't regret that. What I regret is ignoring the signs, swallowing the little lies because facing the truth felt harder. I didn't want to be the paranoid husband, the one who doubts without cause. But the betrayal had been unfolding right in front of me. I could hear her moving around the house, but I stayed put. I didn't want to see her face, not with that same indifferent look she had when she told me I'd get over it. Like my pain was just a phase. I replayed the past few months in my head, dissecting every detail, trying to find the moment I lost her, if I ever truly had her at all. The business trips. That's when it started, wasn't it? More frequent, always urgent meetings or last-minute changes. I never questioned it. She was ambitious, and I wanted to support that. But now it all seemed suspect. She stopped sharing details, stopped checking in. When she got back, there was no excitement, no eagerness to reconnect. Then there was her sudden social life. She'd never been the outgoing type, but suddenly, she had a new circle of friends from work, from the gym, from places I'd never heard of. Late nights out, sometimes not coming home at all, claiming she crashed at a friend's after too many drinks. And I believed her, even when she became protective of her phone, even when she stepped out to take calls. The arguments were the final clue, pointless fights over trivial things. Why I hadn't done the dishes immediately, why I wasn't more ambitious at work, why I wasn't spontaneous enough. I thought it was stress, the wear and tear of a long-term relationship. But now I see it clearly. She was justifying her choices, convincing herself she had reasons for what she was doing. It made me sick. This wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate. She knew exactly what she was doing and never planned to stop. My hands curled into fists, nails biting into my palms. But I wasn't angry, not yet. The anger would come later. Right now, I just felt empty. Bone-deep exhaustion settled over me. The worst part wasn't the betrayal. It was knowing she didn't even care if I found out. She hadn't been careful because she didn't think she had to be. She believed I'd be hurt, maybe devastated. But eventually, I'd forgive her. That was her biggest mistake. I wasn't going to be that person. The one who stays because it's easier. The one who forgives out of habit. I stood up. I didn't know what I was going to do next. But I knew one thing for sure. Our marriage was over. She just didn't realize it yet. I don't know how long I stood there, letting it all sink in. When I finally walked out, she was at the dining table, scrolling through her phone like nothing had happened. Like we hadn't just crossed a line we could never uncross. She barely glanced up as I passed. No apology, no explanation, no remorse. She wasn't afraid, and that hurt the most. She didn't think she had anything to lose. I grabbed my keys and left. I needed to breathe. I needed to be anywhere but there. There's no escaping something like this. It latches onto you, weaving into your mind, settling into corners you thought were secure. I drove without direction, eventually stopping in an empty parking lot, staring blankly at the dashboard, hoping for answers that wouldn't come. I could have stayed out all night, but when I finally went back, she was already asleep, as if it were just another ordinary evening, as if nothing had come undone. For a time, I left things as they were, not because I forgave her, not because I held on to hope, but because I needed to observe. I needed to see if she'd acknowledge the fracture, if she'd reach out, if she'd even bother to pretend she cared. She didn't. The next day unfolded under the guise of normalcy. Coffee brewed, emails answered, a casual glance out the window to check the weather. I sat across from her, searching for a sign. But there was nothing. No hesitation, no flicker of remorse, not even the hollow comfort of small talk. I tested the silence, withholding my words to see how long she could maintain the illusion, how long she could pretend that nothing critical had splintered between us. Days slipped by like that. The silence thickened, becoming almost a physical presence. She continued her routine, coming home late, her phone never out of reach, treating me like background noise, an object too familiar to notice. But for me, everything had shifted. The house that once felt like a refuge now echoed with the emptiness of a stranger's space. The walls seemed to close in, the air grew heavier. Even the daylight felt harsh, exposing truths I had long ignored. I stopped sitting with her during meals, stopped responding to her half-hearted questions about my day, stopped pretending we were simply enduring a rough patch. This wasn't a temporary storm. This was the aftermath, and I didn't know how much longer I could live among the wreckage. She carried on as if the chasm between us was insignificant, as if my absence from our bed was irrelevant, as if she hadn't reduced everything we built to rubble and expected me to coexist with the ruins. So I confronted it. No grand plan, no perfect timing. Those opportunities had vanished the moment she looked me in the eyes, believing I'd eventually forgive her. One evening, I walked in, saw her on the couch with her laptop, and said, "We need to talk." She didn't look up right away, just finished typing, then closed the laptop like she was doing me a favor. Okay, that was all. No pause, no concern. Just that empty, indifferent okay. I sat down across from her. I was done playing along. How long? I asked. Her lips tightened into a thin line, caught off guard by the directness. Does it matter? I let out a dry, bitter laugh. Yeah, it does. She sighed, leaning back, arms crossed over her chest. A while. I nodded, even though I had suspected as much. Hearing it aloud shifted something inside me. Why? I asked. She tilted her head slightly, studying me like I was an abstract puzzle. Because I could. I blinked. That's it? She shrugged. What do you want me to say? That I was unhappy? That I felt stuck? Would that make it easier? It wasn't her words that hurt the most. It was the detachment in her voice, the lack of any attempt to soften the blow, as if she had accepted this truth long ago and saw no reason to dress it up. You didn't even try to hide it, I said, shaking my head. Did you want me to find out? A pause. I didn't care if you did. I just stared at her. I had spent so long trying to understand. Why she did it. Why she stayed. Why she thought I'd eventually move past it. But in that moment, I realized I'd been asking the wrong questions. It wasn't about being lost, or falling for someone else, or trying to fill some void in our marriage. She did it because I was never part of the equation. I wasn't someone she betrayed. I was just someone who found out. Something inside me snapped then, the last fragile thread giving way. I leaned forward, elbows resting on my knees, locking eyes with her. You think I'm going to stay? She didn't flinch. You think I'll get over this? Wake up one day and decide it's not worth ending everything over? Still no reaction. You're wrong. That's when I saw it. A flicker of surprise, brief but unmistakable. Not regret, not fear, just the shock of realizing she might have miscalculated. But it vanished almost instantly, replaced by that same cold, indifferent expression, the look she gave me when she assumed I'd forgive her, convinced none of this would change anything. She thought she had me figured out, thought I'd yell, break something, demand explanations, maybe threaten to leave, but ultimately stay. She had no idea. I stood up, didn't argue, didn't ask more questions. I had all the answers I needed. I grabbed my jacket, walked past her without another word. Where are you going? She asked, a hint of curiosity finally slipping through. I didn't respond. I didn't look back. This wasn't her game anymore. That night, sleep was a distant memory. My mind was sharp, clear in a way it hadn't been for weeks, maybe longer. The fog of this slow-motion collapse had lifted. I knew exactly what needed to be done. I didn't want revenge. I didn't crave a dramatic confrontation or some elaborate plan to make her hurt. She'd already lost me, whether she realized it or not. That was enough. What I wanted was freedom. The next morning, I called a lawyer. I had no idea what to expect. Divorce was never something I thought I'd face. But I was done wasting time. Done pretending there was anything left to fix. The paperwork, the legal details, the logistics. I was ready. She didn't see it coming. She noticed the shift, of course. Anyone would. I stopped participating in her charade. My silence wasn't about waiting anymore. I was beyond reacting. She wasn't the center of my world. I could tell it unsettled her, the way she expected tension or conflict, but found nothing left to manipulate. Then came the moment she wasn't prepared for. I came home, dropped a stack of papers on the counter and slid them toward her. You need to sign. She glanced at the documents, then at me, her calm facade cracking. You're serious? I placed a pen beside her hand. Completely. She hesitated. That was new. She had spent so long believing this was temporary, that my anger would fade, that I'd revert to the man who let things slide. She finally understood that man was gone. For the first time, she struggled to find the right words. There's no hurry, she murmured, her tone calm yet tentative, as though navigating fragile ground. We can think this through. But her sentence trailed off, unfinished. This was the moment. This was when she realized I wasn't bluffing, wasn't attempting to sway her emotions. This was the breaking point. I noticed the slightest flicker in her eyes. Not sorrow over losing me, not regret for what she'd done, but a raw, unguarded fear of losing control. The authority she once wielded had slipped through her fingers. She had always convinced herself she was in command, believing she would determine when and how our story would end. She assumed I would stay until she decided otherwise, and even if I left, it would still be by her design. But she was wrong. I had no desire to prove her wrong with arguments. My actions spoke volumes. She didn't sign the papers right away, as I had anticipated. It wasn't love, it wasn't remorse, and it certainly wasn't guilt that caused her hesitation. It was control. The realization that she no longer dictated the course of events unsettled her more than anything else. Days passed. She made subtle moves to regain her footing, trying to lure me back into familiar dynamics. Suddenly she was attentive again, asking about my day, initiating casual conversations as if nothing had shattered between us. Her efforts were so calculated, so meticulously staged, that their lack of authenticity hurt more than her silence ever did. One evening she cooked dinner, choosing a dish she knew was my favorite. She arranged the table with precision, poured 2 glasses of wine, and sat across from me. Her expression donned with the same confident facade she wore when she once claimed I would eventually forgive her. "We don't have to go through with this," she whispered, idly swirling the wine in her glass. "We can fix this." I let her talk. I listened as she pieced together every phrase she thought might sway me, acknowledging her mistakes, insisting that every relationship endures struggles, suggesting my resentment was fleeting and would fade with time. Then she said it. "This doesn't have to be the end." I placed my fork down, met her eyes, and replied, "It already is." She searched my face, desperate for a sign, a hesitation, a crack in my resolve, the faintest shadow of doubt. But there was nothing. That was when the truth settled in. Not the loss itself, not yet, but the stark reality that her words no longer held any power. I wasn't really listening anymore. She wasn't extraordinary. She wasn't untouchable. She wasn't the exception. She was simply someone who had made a choice, and now she had to live with its consequences. The next morning she signed the papers. Not because she had accepted it, not because she was at peace with it, but because she finally understood that delaying the inevitable wouldn't change a thing. She tried to conceal her feelings, but I noticed the tension in her grip, the slight quiver in her handwriting as she signed her name. When she slid the documents back to me, she finally voiced the question she had been avoiding. "Is this really what you want?" I picked them up, folded them neatly, and stood. "No," I replied quietly, "but it's what I need." She had misread me from the beginning. I didn't forgive her, and I never would. My friend, and this is the end of the story. If you liked this story, then put your royal like and subscribe to the channel. May the force be with you. Greetings, my dear viewer. This is a channel about marital infidelity and about the consequences if one spouse starts to cheat on the other. If you, as well as I do, support true family values and condemn cheating, then subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. Let's get started. Most evenings, I usually got home before Samantha, giving me ample time to prepare everything. Once all was set, I needed to figure out how to kill time until she arrived. When I finally heard the garage door begin its familiar rumble, I took one last look at myself in the bathroom mirror. Straightening my tie, I turned and headed downstairs. The timing couldn't have been better. Samantha stood at the bottom of the staircase, her eyes locked on me as I descended. Spotting the suit and tie I had on, she raised an eyebrow. "I didn't know we had plans tonight," she said. "We don't," I replied simply. "Then why are you dressed like that if you're not going anywhere?" "Because I am going somewhere," I answered with a small smile. Her voice sharpened. "What's going on, Brian?" "I've got a date," I said casually. "I'd explain, but I'm running late. Don't wait up." Her face twisted with confusion. "A date? With who?" she demanded. Before she could say anything else, I was already at the front door. As I opened it, I heard her call out, "Wait a second, Brian, we need to—" But her words were cut off when I stepped outside and shut the door behind me. Fortunately, my truck didn't fit in the garage, giving me a head start as she chased after me. I think the shock of the moment slowed her down because, by the time she got outside shouting, "Brian, get back here right now!" I was already in the driver's seat, the engine running. Smiling, I gave her a quick wave, backed out of the driveway, and took off toward the condo where my date lived. To truly understand how we got to this point, I need to go back to where it all began. I first crossed paths with Samantha Ford during my senior year at State University. At the time, I was studying business management and had enrolled in a course on managerial decision-making. The classroom was packed, and there was only one seat left, right next to mine. Samantha walked in alongside the professor, glanced around, and made her way toward that empty chair. Some people claim love at first sight doesn't exist, but in that moment, I became a believer. From the second I saw her, I was convinced she was the one. I hadn't even spoken to her, but I was already daydreaming about buying an engagement ring. She sat down, turned to me, and said, "Good morning." My mind raced as I thought, this is it. Before I could answer, the professor started the lecture. Not that it mattered. I barely processed anything. My focus was entirely on the striking brunette beside me. When class ended, I followed her into the hallway. Thanks to roll call, I already knew her name. Gently tapping her shoulder, I waited for her to turn around before introducing myself. "Hi, I'm Brian," I said with a grin. "This might not be the most romantic setting, but will you marry me?" She chuckled, clearly amused but not thrown off. "I'm not so sure about that," she said. "But if you ask me out the right way, I might say yes to dinner." "Are you free tonight?" I asked eagerly. "I am," she replied with a smile. "Dinner sounds lovely." That evening, I learned a lot about her. Samantha was a transfer student majoring in accounting, working toward becoming a CPA. She loved the color blue and enjoyed nearly every genre of music, except rap, which she insisted didn't qualify as music at all. I shared a bit about myself, an only child majoring in business management, planning to take over my family's company someday. We arranged for me to pick her up at 6. The night was unforgettable. She laughed at my premature questions about her ring size and wedding preferences. When I assured her I was serious, she shook her head in disbelief. "We've just met," she said. "You're moving way too fast." I didn't mind her hesitation. I knew deep down we were meant to be. Over the following months, Samantha made it clear she wasn't ready to settle down. She often turned me down, saying she had other commitments. By the time Christmas came around, I decided to take a step back. Not because my feelings had changed, but because seeing her with someone else was too painful. At one point, my fraternity hosted a party, and I invited her. She politely declined, saying she already had a date. I went alone, only to see her arrive 40 minutes later, on the arm of Jake Cochran. Watching her with him hurt more than I could admit, especially since Jake had a reputation for being the kind of guy you'd want to avoid. Unable to bear it, I left early. After that, I skipped most holiday parties. But when my cousin Rachel came to visit, my family insisted I take her to one on campus. Begrudgingly, I agreed. On the way there, Rachel noticed my reluctance and asked why. After I explained, she gave me a knowing smile and proposed an idea. At the party, Samantha noticed us almost immediately. Rachel leaned in close and whispered, "Is that her?" I nodded toward the woman in the blue dress by the wall. Flashing a mischievous grin, Rachel slipped her arm through mine. Moments later, Samantha walked up and introduced herself. "Are you trying to steal my man?" she asked Rachel. Rachel smirked and replied, "If he were really yours, he wouldn't be here with me." Then, she pulled me toward the other side of the room, leaving Samantha behind to process what had just happened. I gave them the green light to ask her out. Before we headed out, I told them I needed a quick trip to the restroom. When I returned, Samantha was standing there waiting for me. "I meant it," she said. "Meant what?" I asked, puzzled. "That you're my guy," she clarified. "If you had told me that earlier, I'd have invited you to the party with me tonight." "Why didn't you?" she asked, a hint of frustration in her voice. "Because the last few times I asked you to go out, you had other plans. After being turned down 3 times, I figured I'd stop trying." "Sorry, but I need to find my date," I said before walking away. On the drive home, Rachel, my date for the evening, broke the silence. "Your fraternity brothers are seriously disloyal." "What makes you say that?" I asked, glancing at her. Even though I was clearly there with you, they kept hitting on me. They're not being disloyal, I explained. They know I'm hung up on someone else. They asked if there was anything between us, and when I said no, they wanted to see if they had a chance. I told them it was fine. You could have given me a heads up, she replied. There were a couple of them I might have said yes to. Hearing that, I made a sudden U-turn. Rachel looked at me, startled. What are you doing? Heading back to the party to see if those guys are still around, I said plainly. When we returned, I left Rachel to mingle and went to the game room to shoot some pool. Eventually, she came downstairs and said she was ready to leave, so we headed home. One of those guys, Ed Catron, later ended up marrying her. The next morning, Samantha called and asked me to meet her for lunch at the countryside pub. Curiosity got the better of me, so I agreed. When I arrived, she was already seated. Before I could say anything, she spoke. I've figured out what I want for Christmas, she said. And what's that? I asked. An engagement ring. Remember when you asked me my ring size? I don't remember it, she admitted. But we can go to Zariel's and find out after lunch. Not to question this sudden interest. But what's brought on the change of heart? I asked. I've dated enough to know what's out there, and you're the best I've found, she explained. Plus that little stunt with your cousin made me realize I could lose you. Wait, how do you know Rachel's my cousin? She told me, Samantha said. She came up to me when I looked upset and assured me she was family, not competition. I clarified everything to Samantha, explaining how I hadn't even wanted to attend the party but had been persuaded. Regardless, she was right. It had worked. 6 weeks after graduation, Samantha and I were married. She still had a year left in college, so I suggested waiting, but she was determined to get married right away. I wanted something small and simple, but our families insisted on a grand wedding. The next 8 years were some of the best of my life. Samantha and I were as close as newlyweds, but then Tyler Scott entered the picture. Tyler transferred to Samantha's office from Cleveland and decided she was the woman he wanted. He started pursuing her, and whether it was the 8-year itch or something else, she began to reciprocate. It started with casual lunches and eventually led to drinks after work. What Samantha didn't realize was that Hal Thomas, a former classmate of mine, worked in the same office. She wasn't discreet, so Hal noticed her behavior. He called me to share what he'd seen. So far, things hadn't gone beyond lunches, hand-holding, and a few kisses. She always came home on time, and they hadn't left any events together. But Hal's next call changed everything. He overheard them planning a Saturday date that would end in a hotel room. Worse, Samantha intended to come home afterward and tell me she wanted to date Tyler. I decided to act. Leaving work early, I approached Angela Harding from accounting for help. "What's up, Brian?" she asked, surprised. "I need a dinner and dancing partner tonight," I told her. When I explained the situation, Angela was shocked. Despite not liking Samantha, she agreed to help. She understood how serious I was. When I picked Angela up, she looked stunning in a sleek black dress. She caught my gaze and smiled. "Thanks." "For what?" I asked. "For the compliment you didn't say out loud," she teased. We went to Duke's Steakhouse for dinner and then to Granada Hall for dancing. I chose those spots knowing Samantha's friends worked there, and word would spread quickly. During the slow dances, Angela leaned into me, enjoying the attention and ensuring Samantha would hear about it. Despite Angela's clear intentions, I had no plans to take things further. After the night ended, I walked her to her door. She kissed me and invited me in, but I declined. "That's not what tonight was about," I said. "Thank you for helping me." I kissed her cheek and left. Instead of going home, I went to a Waffle House, had coffee, and read the paper until 4 a.m. When I got home, Samantha was awake, sitting on the couch. I smiled at her and walked past without saying a word, heading straight to bed. Moments later, she followed me into the room. "I can smell her perfume," she said. "Who was she?" "You already know," I replied. "2 of my friends called, but they didn't know her name," she said, waiting for an answer. It was Angela Harding. "That disgusting woman? You wrecked our marriage over her?" I sighed. "Let me ask you something. How did you feel when I left tonight? Did you wonder why you weren't enough for me? Did you question if you'd done something wrong? Her anger was palpable, but she didn't respond immediately. Finally, she exploded. How could you? 8 years. 8 whole years that I had believed were some of the best of my life. Yet you threw it all away for the sake of some meaningless fling. I looked her square in the eyes and said, "Go ahead. Don't stop now. You're on a roll." My words dripped with sarcasm. "Are you serious, Lee? Do you think this is funny?" she snapped, disbelief coloring her voice. A sly smirk crept across my face. "Well, if you think about it, there's a certain irony in all this. Let me get this straight. You're furious with me for seeing another woman. So furious, in fact, that you're considering divorce. Is that about right?" She shook her head, her expression a mix of confusion and exasperation, as though she couldn't believe what she was hearing. "And another thing," I continued. "Why are you so quick to label Angie an adulteress? What exactly do you call a woman who goes out with a married man?" Her reply was swift and sharp. "Oh, is that how you're spinning this? Then tell me, what would you call a married woman who's seeing someone other than her husband?" "By your own reasoning," I said, my tone cutting. "That would make her an adulteress too. Thanks for pointing that out." Her face twisted with anger. "You're unbelievable. Are you seriously calling me an adulteress?" "Just stating the facts," I replied. "You're a married woman, and you've been spending time with Tyler Scott, haven't you?" The color drained from her face, her mind clearly racing as she tried to gauge just how much I knew. I leaned back in my chair, letting a wry smile tug at my lips. "Here's something for you to think about. Do you remember how you felt last night when I walked out of the room? Replay that moment in your mind, but from my perspective. That's exactly what you were planning to put me through with your plans to meet Scott tonight." I didn't give her the chance to respond. And let's be honest here. We both know where this so-called date was headed. A cheap motel, right? But you made one big mistake. What on earth made you think I'd just lie down and let this happen? Have I ever given you any reason to believe I'd tolerate something like that? I stood up and looked down at her. "For the record, if Scott had shown up here tonight to pick you up, I would have beaten the hell out of him. But I'm guessing you'll just text him now and arrange to meet somewhere else. Whatever. It's late, and I'm done with this conversation. I'm going to bed." Without waiting for a reply, I turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, stunned. I half expected her to come after me, to try to argue or justify her actions, but she didn't. The next morning, when I came downstairs, I found her asleep on the couch. Why she had chosen the couch instead of our bed, I didn't bother asking. I quietly made a pot of coffee, poured myself a cup, and stepped out onto the patio. As I sipped the hot brew, my mind churned with possibilities. Divorce? Perhaps, but that would be a last resort. As much as it pained me to admit it, I still loved her. Despite everything, I couldn't deny that fact. However, love alone wouldn't be enough, not if she had already crossed a line with Scott. Thankfully, based on what I'd learned from Hal, she hadn't gone that far. Yet. Ultimately, I realized the decision wasn't mine alone. It came down to Samantha. If she wasn't willing to fight for our marriage, there would be nothing left to save. And if she went through with that date, it would be over. End of story. I had been sitting outside for about 10 minutes when she joined me, her own coffee in hand. She sat across from me, took a sip, and broke the silence. "What would you like for dinner tonight?" "I'm not really in the mood for a home-cooked meal," I said, keeping my eyes on the horizon. "I'll probably grab something while I'm out." She shook her head gently. "No, I'm asking what you want me to make for dinner." I looked at her, raising an eyebrow. "I thought you had plans tonight." "Not anymore," she said softly. Her words caught me off guard. I studied her face as she went on. "This morning I realized how close I was to destroying something incredible. Our marriage, my life with an amazing man. For what? A meaningless fling with someone who doesn't even come close to you. There's no excuse for what I did. I let his compliments go to my head. Somewhere along the way, I stopped valuing the same kind of affection from you because I convinced myself you only said those things out of obligation. But when it came from someone else, it felt like validation, proof that I was still desirable." She paused, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. The truth is, the furthest it ever went was a few kisses and holding hands. That's all. But now, because of my stupidity, I've got to work harder than ever to prove to you that I've come to my senses. I stared at her for what felt like an eternity. Finally, I said, I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's not going to be easy. Then I'll start right now, she said, her voice steady and determined. How about we go inside and work up an appetite before I take you out for breakfast? A faint smile tugged at my lips as I stood to follow her. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance for us to rebuild. After all, it seemed like she truly wanted to try. My friend, and this is the end of the story. If you liked this story, then put your royal like and subscribe to the channel. May the force be with you.